You know, Jay-Z, one of the best rappers ever, one of the best artists ever, he did a song about taking his career to the next level. And the words he used in this song to describe this was he wanted to be the next Lyor. Lyor Cohen has helped the careers of Run DMC, Public Enemy, Beastie Boys, DMX, Kanye West, Jay-Z, and countless others. Now he has another key position in the music world as the global head of music for YouTube. His main focus is still to seal the deal between artists and fans. So I thought before we start, there's so many questions I want to ask you about YouTube, for instance. But if we just fast forward through your early years, you were born in 1959 to Israeli immigrants. Growing up, you switched time between Israel and America. You went to university in Miami, where you studied global marketing and finance. Yeah. And then you went back to Los Angeles, started to work in a big bank, and this was the supposed plan. You were supposed to do this. Yep. But while in Los Angeles working for the bank, you discovered this new culture and music, hip-hop. Can we start there? What happened and what attracted you to this culture?
First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for coming and listening to me. I'm pinching myself to be here with all of you. Thanks. I would say, first of all, the first rap station in the world came from Los Angeles. It was 1580 K-Day. And I loved listening to it. But the first time that I've ever digested the beat was my brother was a woodshop teacher in South Central Los Angeles at a high school called Vermont Day, and he would take me to the basketball games. They were the #1 basketball team. And every chance they had, every break, a guy with a bass and some guys with drums and dancers would run on the middle of the court and have some of the funkiest beats I've ever been. And I remember as a young kid, I was like, I can't believe what I just heard or what I just saw. And much later, when I listened to the radio station, I recognized many of those beats. So I started getting interested and curious about it. And that's how it happened. I went to college, and my parents paid for my college. And so when my mother helped get a job at the National Bank of Israel in Beverly Hills, I just felt like it was the natural course. You know, I spent all this money getting a degree, and now I'm going to work at a bank. But I was really miserable. And one thing that my parents always encouraged all 4 boys was to do everything in their power to avoid work and to find passion. And I had some friends that were throwing parties, and they had very successful parties. And they kept saying, "Why are you still at the bank? What are you doing at the bank? Come join us." And I finally decided to come join them, but I said I needed to do something different than just throwing a party. I wanted to have concert, and that's how I hired Run DMC. There were like 6 Hollywood performers before, all unsigned: the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Fear, Social Distortion.
And this was very early. I mean, people didn't think of mixing this culture back then. This was like 6 or 7 years before Lollapalooza, for instance.
Right. it felt natural to me.
Yeah, yeah,
And I wanted to I wanted to put a show on that I would appreciate spending my money going to. So
yeah.
that's what happened. And
You told me when doing this concert, when Run DMC performed, Run
you have a
suddenly
very good,
wanted to leave the stage because he was afraid of these scary people in the audience. Can you
yeah.
tell that story?
Well, there's a thing called stage diving. It's a big punk thing. Kids would jump on the stage and run along and dance along the singers and the band members, and then fling themselves into the audience. And when they came on the stage, Run DMC thought that they were being attacked and not appreciated. So he ran off stage, and of course, the headliners, and it would have been a huge problem for me. And I went backstage and I asked him, what's going on? He says, you didn't see what I saw? I said, I don't know what you saw. He said, they didn't like what I was doing, and they came to physically take me off. I couldn't understand what he was talking about. And then I realized the whole stage diving thing. I said, actually, they are there only to show you a lot of appreciation, dance with you, and jump off. And he looked at me and said, what? Why would they do that? And so he says, I'm going to trust you. And he went back on stage. And for the rest of the night, he was flinging little white kids off the stage and had the best time. In fact, that's how I got into my life, is because he called his brother and recommended that I go back to New York and work for them. And when people ask me, so if you didn't go to New York, what would you have done? I have no clue. I have no clue what would have happened to me.
And Run's brother is Russell Simmons,
Yeah.
who had then started Def Jam Records with Rick Rubin, who's still the most iconic hip-hop label ever. But this was very early in the days, and they persuaded you to come to New York, and you went to their little office on Elizabeth Street.
It was before Elizabeth Street. You went to Elizabeth.
Even there, okay.
Yeah, 26 in Broadway
Yeah.
was the first office. And by the way, Def Jam didn't have an office at that time. Def Jam was just an idea in Rick's dorm. Rush was a management company before Def Jam. And I remember going to the office straight with my luggage. And when I walked in, I thought there was going to be a marching band because Russell described that you're going to be our partner, you're going to, this is going to be fantastic for you. Meanwhile, he never came to the office. He never told the three people, the office is the size of this carpet. He never told the three people that I was coming. And when I walked in and said, hey, I'm Lyor, I'm the new partner here, they didn't know what I was talking about, and they all looked depressed. And I said, what was going on? What's happening? They said, well, Run DMC is at JFK going to Europe on their first tour. And the road manager with the passport is on a cocaine binge and can't be found. And none of us have a passport. And I said, well, I have a passport. And they looked at me and said, we don't know who you are, but if you wouldn't mind going to JFK. And I drove to JFK. My mother insisted, please call me when you get to New York, please, just to let me know that everything's okay. Because of all the commotion and everything, I called her a day later, and I was calling her from London. And yeah, that's how I became the road manager, actually, of Run DMC. So who knows if he actually had his shit together and was there, what I would be doing, because when I came, certainly the guys remembered me from that show, and it took less time to warm up. We come from different worlds and stuff like that, but then they recognized that I got them on time. In fact, I was the road manager for 3.5 years, excuse me, We never missed a gig, ever missed a gig. And sometimes, one time we had 5 gigs in 3 different states. And so we were very mobile, very efficient. And yeah, it was lovely. It was a lovely period of time. I wish I had smartphones to take more photos of that experience. And I guess I did what most kids do, think about what's next and how to get to the next thing, that I didn't hold on to a precious time of,
Yeah.
yeah.
The first time I went to New York, I did a story about Def Jam and Rush, but Russell Simmons was supposed to be there. He didn't show up then either, so it was the other guys who
It's the
talked to
story
me.
of my life.
Yeah. Run DMC, they were not part of the mainstream yet, but they were very big in New York, and they did a concert on Madison Square Garden, which was quite incredible for an act like that to do, like a street act. And you were a part of, because Run DMC, they dressed in these black hats and gym clothes with stripes, those iconic shoes. And you realized something when they did that gig. You were a part of inviting the bosses from a German sneaker company to that concert. And everything sort of changed. We still live in that world now. But can you tell us about that? What happened? What did you do?
It was, for me, one of the most miserable evenings of my life, because it was the first time a rapper played Madison Square Garden. So it wasn't just an achievement for Run DMC, it was achievement for the art form. And the art form decided, just like it always did, that there's no such thing as a backstage pass. And I remember the backstage being horrific, overrun. And I remember the big boss of Madison Square Garden said, "There's no money large enough for me to ever have another rapper back in the garden." And it was a big learning experience for me, because I was in control and let the whole thing get out of sync. But the positive thing that came out of that show was Run DMC's authentic passion and love for the Adidas sneaker and clothes. And it was so obvious about, they weren't paid to endorse. They just loved the product so much. And it's, I think back then there was a lot of, hey, I hire you to endorse my product. And I think this was one of the first times that people really understood that you can't fake it. And so that's why it was such a great deal for Adidas and a great deal for Run DMC. Before Run DMC, when you talk about the Cold Crush Brothers, Grandmaster Flash, the Furious Five, it was coming out of disco. And it was aspirational. So if you take a look at the early rappers in the late 70s, early 80s, it was all sequins. It was all very glamorous leather and, aspirational, I'm a star. And Run DMC dressed simply as someone from the hood would dress. And it was a really profound nuance, because suddenly you didn't have to reach for the stars that may be out of reach, but all of a sudden you had someone. It was during the period, I remember, because I was there, the dying of disco. And the disco was very exclusive. And it was the rise of rap music, which was more inclusive. And so that was interesting times back then. Yeah. I'm probably the only person in the history to have gone from Studio 54 to the disco fever in the Bronx and then Save the Robots in Alphabet City. I mean, it was just amazing,
Yeah.
amazing era
Yeah.
back then.
And these bosses who had flown over from like Munich, and when they saw this audience holding up their shell toes and chanting "My Adidas," they must have, had they any preparation for what they would see?
I don't think anybody could be prepared
Uh,
for what they saw, especially Germans coming to the States. It was at that point exclusively black, so it felt a little bit dangerous,
Yeah.
exciting, on the edge of something happening, and I think you could just see the joy and the high-fiving. I wish I was more sophisticated. I would have made a better deal for the kids. Had I, what's that Faces song? If I only know what I know now, or I don't know. I wish I knew what I know now.
Yeah, sure.
So.
When I was younger.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you helped to create something there that we still live in, the collaborations between artists and companies or brands. And you always sort of done the same thing back then and back now, which is you sort of help the artist, you're on the artist side, to help them get the best possible deal. Do you agree with that? Is that the same thing you try to do now as the global head of music for YouTube?
Well, I think that all these platforms are dumb pipes if there's not wonderful creation happening. And so making sure that creation is healthy and, people who decide to choose a creative industry need to pay taxes, feed their families, send their kids to school and stuff like that. So it's incredibly joyful for us. One of our metrics that we watch closely is creators making it. And we've been seeing a wonderful, CAGR of artists making it and creators making it because it just, it's just good for the creative industries. And it's wonderful to watch. And,
yeah. And that's like the new scene where you go to discover new stuff. You open your laptop or your phone and you go to mostly YouTube to get to new information and excitement.
Well, so in traditional media, they cannot be as risk takers because if you have to play to the fat part of the curve. Otherwise, they just move the channel and they'll go outside of your ecosystem. And so I think YouTube is a possibility to bring the fringe and to nurture the fringe and the avant-garde and the tasty, allow it to percolate and to grow and to get nourished and develop fan after fan after fan. And suddenly you get the explosion of Afrobeats or Latin music. So for me, I'm pinching myself to see. I went with colleagues down to Africa, to Nigeria about 4 years ago. And we had this met all the ecosystem there. And I wrote a blog that I felt, if you listen to the melodies, you would know for certain that it will have a global impact. And that's what I wrote in my blog, and it's nice to see, Burna Boy selling out, Madison Square Garden, or, all the growth of that genre, and it's nice to see. It's something I don't think you would be able to get had it not been for YouTube.
You've been always managed to do that during 40 years, always sort of finding the next thing. A lot of people get comfortable in their own taste, sort of, but you're always on top, still on the top, and looking for new things.
Well, that's very nice of you. It's not. I have to tell you, I was mentioning to someone earlier that I actually enjoy the friction where the sparks happen. It's the most interesting for me. I actually like to change things when they're working, not when they're not working. And I remember when I started 300, the front of the office door, I painted a Bob Dylan lyric, "If you're not busy being born, you're busy dying."
That's brilliant. Yeah.
And that's just how I feel. It's like it's not for everybody. You know, when you are in the friction and sparks are flying, you get singed. And certainly, I've been singed. It's not, like I said, it's not for everybody. But the joy that I get to see certain things happen certainly outweighs the disappointments or the singeing that I get when I'm deep into the friction. I don't consider, I know it sounds strange that I went from traditional media to YouTube. One of the things that I did was, and they're still trying to figure out why I'm still there and why I'm reasonably successful. And I would simply say is I declared that I was going to remain my most authentic self. I wasn't going to try to pretend that I'm now a new tech guy and I happen to be in the music business. I'm actually, I'm still throwing pigeons out the window with notes. It's like, to me, I'm a music person that happens to work in YouTube and Google. Yeah. And I think by declaring myself as the most authentic self, my colleagues appreciate and understand where I'm coming from.
One problem for streaming services getting credibility in the music business and with artists are that they are tech guys, they're not music guys. But you are an exception here.
I take exception to that. So when I was walking for the first time through the hallways of Google and YouTube, I recognized how many music heads there actually are. In fact, there must be some correlation between math and music because all the engineers, like the head of Sweden, showed us the offices where there's a studio, playing studio for certain engineers that are band members. I remember building a studio in the Chelsea market in New York. So they have a deep desire and love for music, and they are musical. The thing that they haven't had as much exposure is the whole process around it. And I was originally hired to be the bridge.
Yeah, exactly.
And that wasn't interesting to me because I have to remember, jot things down and go back and forth. Instead, I like to put together. So, last week, we had an offsite in London, and I had the music industry meet the head of engineering, the head of product, the head of user experience, and I get out of the way and let them build beautiful products. I mean, we are doing really great, and we have a lot to do. We have 2 billion daily active users, and there's a lot of people that really rely on the platform, both the user and the creator, and it's very exciting to watch what's happening. So
ever since streaming took over from sales. A lot of musicians, songwriters have been complaining that you should get paid more for streaming. But you wrote a great blog post about that, and you actually told people that, I think it was in 2021, YouTube, if I remember correctly, paid $4 billion to the music industry.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? Yeah.
Well, you're going to be shocked when we tell you guys the next number. All I could say is we have a twin engine growth story. People really didn't appreciate, they called it free, YouTube free. I always describe it's not free, you're paying with your eyeballs. And now we've layered a subscription service, so we're actually meeting the user where they are. Some people want to pay with their, or can only pay with their eyeballs. Other people pay with a subscription. And now, when you think about it, typical media companies have one engine in subscription and one engine in advertising. We are working on all areas. One of the most important part is to continue explaining, and now we're starting to have a joint voice. Now the music industry and YouTube don't have the friction that it's had before. And so advertisers are starting to even dig music on YouTube harder because it's a joint effort. So the growth in advertising has been spectacular. And of course, in subscription, we're one of the fastest growing subscription products out there. And it's the twin engines. And, you know, that's just money. We're also trying to make sure that all the artists are able to find their audience. So it's fame and fortune that we work on. I would like to say that because last week I had the great pleasure of having a fireside chat with Bjorn from ABBA in London. And he's deeply passionate, so are we, about improving the metadata. We are living in a digital world with imperfect information. So part of the friction is that there are a lot of wonderful compositions and songwriters that aren't getting remunerated because of imperfect information. And he has this program called Sessions. We're working with him. We are working very hard to make sure that the metadata is great, and those who were there recording, performing on a composition end up getting paid. And so that's another thing that we're working heavily on.
And this session project is when you record a new song, you should specify who was actually there, who played on it, who was part of writing song, to make sure the money goes to the right person afterwards. Yeah.
You know what happens? It's all memory after the fact, and lawyers and managers, and everybody forgets what they agreed to at that moment. And so it's fantastic to see. All these problems over time will be solved. I mean, we are living in a digital age. It should be much more perfect in terms of information. So,
If you go back to when you worked around DMC, for instance, when you meet young artists now, what advice would you give them how to use streaming or YouTube? How can they actually use it to their benefit?
So I actually didn't invent this line. People in the industry are always talking about artists should always be on. And someone last week said, occasionally brilliant. I love that.
And what do you mean with occasionally brilliant?
So one of the sad parts of this whole era is these artists have to do likes, followers, subscribers, have so many duties in the social sense, and they're always, the record companies are saying always on, a little bit of content there, a little bit of content there, a little bit of content there. And this man who was running a major record company said, focus on occasionally brilliant. I thought it was just a perfect way of saying it. Last week, I had the great pleasure of going to see Paolo Nutini perform in the CD 100, the 100 Club in London. He was prepping, he's been gone for, 5 years. Became a cab driver in Mexico City. And his new album is brilliant. His performance is brilliant. A few hundred people saw him at this club. He's going to perform for 100,000 people at one of these huge festivals. And it's hard being an artist now because of all these different, things that they have to do. So I think one of the, so being occasionally brilliant, writing a beautiful song. Listen, I always said, in this digital world, there's a moment of truth. And that moment of truth is live, because there's a lot of faking going on out there. But there's a moment of truth that happens, and it's on stage, where you have to perform. And the kids are able to recognize what's fake and what's not. And so advice for new artists is to write brilliant songs, make, of course, great visuals. I was in India opening up our subscription service there and met with a poet that is highly influential in the music business. And he said, Indians, we don't hear music, we see music. And so I think, especially with YouTube, you have the ability to create context to your lyrics, and of course, to make sure that you go on the road and do all the critical artist development work. I think this business, one of the lost arts is artist development.
Yeah.
And so I think my advice to an artist is don't take any shortcuts. The long journey, enjoy the long journey.
Talking about artist development, a lot of people nowadays think that you can just watch the data. If you look closely at the data, you can predict who will be the next big artist, what will the next big hit song be. But you are quite skeptical about trusting data more than your instinct.
Well, data will get you to the neighborhood, and taste will actually find you the next great artist. My son is running all the data A&R for 300. Every record company's got the same data. So they all show up knocking at this person's door at the same time. And, it just becomes a bidding war at that point. I think I can tell you how, when I was signing artists, I used to never sign an artist unless I went to their house. When I went to their house, if I saw the artist's mother's photo, that was a green light for me. It's strange. I had my own thing because, some parent had to tolerate the kid banging on pans or, using the garage or the basement. I used to rifle through their records. So I think A&R is, a lazy man's A&R is just data. Yeah. But how do you sit across from someone and see, smell, hear ambition or desire. Grand Poobah of the Brand Nubians told me when I signed him, I was his manager, this music business is nothing but a scam for me. So when you know, that's something I'm not sure you get when you're only looking at the data.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a little more difficult. You have to put in more work. I wish it was that easy, but it's not.
But it makes sense because you've always managed to find these artists that are not only musicians but like characters. When people got to know that I was going to interview you here, one big hip-hop head who's probably here said, you must ask Lyor how did he find and sign DMX? A fantastic character who died tragically last year.
Terrible.
But he's a very good example of someone who probably wouldn't show up on the data. Did you see his mother's photo?
Unfortunately not.
No.
He was in foster care his entire life. Very brutal beginning of his existence. I was invited by Irv Gotti to go to Yonkers to see him. And I arrived at midnight, and he didn't show up till 3 in the morning. But before that, the company, the Rough Riders, knew that I was coming, and so they were taking the opportunity to show me their other artists. And they were performing, and we were wasting time. Oh, don't worry, he's on his way, he's on his way. He finally showed up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he had 3 days ago just broke his jaw, and his jaw was wired shut. So I said, geez, it's 3 in the morning. I've seen all the rappers of Yonkers, and now this guy's jaw is wired. How am I going to understand? And he started rapping, and you could hear the metal breaking. And you saw all the rappers move to the edge of the room. And if my mother was there that night, she would say, son, it's that guy. That's the guy that all the molecules of the room, the air changed at that moment. And that's when I signed him, and he couldn't have come at a more critical time in my life. So Def Jam was created in black and white and shades of gray. That was just the aesthetic. The black inner city experience. There's just truthfulness and hardship. And there was a point that there was an aspirational wave that Puff Daddy and Bad Boy had where it was all Technicolor. I don't know if you remember the Biggie Smalls. Yeah. He's as hard as they come, but at Versace, it was Rolls Royces and boats and everything. Champagne. And it was very big. Mace, Faith. It was a huge, Heavy D. It was a huge movement of aspirational, we don't want to be in the hood. We want to be wherever we decide to be. And I didn't know how to play in that game. And Puffy was an expert in aspirational. And I contemplated retiring at that moment. And I said, I'm not sure I can give anymore. If this is what rap music is going to become, I don't know how to play in it. And at 3:30, after watching this guy bounce around the room, I said, I absolutely know I have more in the tank, and had to sign them. And I don't know if you remember, the first video, the first photo was black and white. And it was the week after I published that photo was when Puffy put the locks in colorful clothes. And these are one of the hardest groups, also from Yonkers, incredible group, all of a sudden put in Technicolor, which I felt was offensive. And then I published the black and white DMX, and the story was over. I just reminded everybody that aspirational is good, but the reality of Black America is really, really still very, very difficult.
Yeah. I think, thank you for telling that. And I think that's a great way to end this, I think. The importance of how you present yourself and how you sound and being authentic. Yeah. And I think you are one of the most inspirational and authentic persons I've ever met in the music industry.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for Lyor Cohen.
Thank you.